Welcome to episode 66 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by true crime FBI cases. In this episode, we get to speak to retired agent Jim Huggins, who served in the FBI for 28 years. During his bureau career, Huggins was assigned to the Minneapolis, Denver, and Louisville Divisions, in addition to special assignments on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation during the Wounded Knee takeovers in 1973 and again in 1975, and during the RESMURS investigation of the murders of two FBI agents, Jack Kohler and Ron Williams. In this episode of FBI Retired Case File Review, Jim Huggins is interviewed about his investigation of FBI agent Mark Putnam, a new agent assigned to a two-man resident agency in Pikeville, Kentucky, high in the Appalachian coal country. Based primarily on Huggins' ability to elicit a confession, Putnam pled guilty and was convicted of strangling in a fit of rage his pregnant informant, Susan Daniels Smith. There's little doubt that the Mark Putnam manslaughter investigation was one of Jim Huggins' most famous cases. However, while he was in Louisville, he also conducted or supervised many of Kentucky's biggest corruption investigations. He served as the supervisor of the Lexington Resident Agency from 1986 until his retirement. After retiring from the FBI, Jim Huggins was appointed by the Kentucky Attorney General as Director of Investigations for the Public Corruption Unit, where he worked for 7 years. Recently, Huggins was hired as a technical consultant for Above Suspicion, the feature film based on the nonfiction book of the same name that depicts the tragic saga of Mark Putnam and Susan Smith. Wow, I have to let you know this is an unbelievable case review, but I want to admit to you that I hesitated in keeping it on the schedule this week. Because if you're listening to this during the second week of May 2017, you know that this week President Trump fired FBI Director Jim Comey. I had the great pleasure of meeting Director Comey on one occasion, and I found him to be very personable and a very effective leader for the FBI. Now, what does that have to do with this episode? Well, of course, this episode is about an embarrassing time for the FBI. I mean, an FBI agent kills and tries to hide that he murdered his pregnant informant. But then I thought about it again and said, oh no, this is the right week because it will assure everyone that the FBI investigates cases in order to find the truth and justice, no matter what the outcome. As you are aware, I am a trained FBI spokesperson. I did it full time for 5 years, so I was concerned when Director Comey, contrary to the FBI's standard media policy, provided personal comments about an ongoing investigation and one where eventually no charges were made. However, that does not mean that I agree with the timing or the way that he was unceremoniously dismissed. So I am posting this episode now because I want everyone to understand that the FBI is an independent law enforcement and intelligence gathering agency. I know for sure that the field agents will continue to investigate all matters before them, no matter who the administration picks as the next director of the FBI. Before we get to the interview, which is absolutely fascinating, I want to thank my FBI Retired Case File Review newsletter subscribers for helping me select the new cover for my novel, Pay to Play. I just want you to know that the same book with a new look is available now on Amazon. As you know, my expenses to produce and host FBI Retired Case File Review are supported by you when you pick up a copy of Pay to Play for yourself or as a gift for someone you know loves crime fiction. You're helping to defray the cost for me to continue to produce ad-free content on a weekly basis. As you can tell from the great reviews, Pay to Play is a good read. So keep the reviews as well as the tweets, posts, and emails coming. I love hearing from you. Now here's the show. I am excited to introduce my guest, Jim Huggins. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Jerry.
So I read an article about you being a consultant on a new movie about Mark Putnam murdering his informant.
Yeah, that's correct. I was approached back last spring by Colleen Kemp and Linda Bruckheimer, who both were the producers on this movie, and they were asking if I would be available to work with them as a FBI technical consultant, since I was the case agent on the investigation. And after meeting with the director, Philip Noyce, who is pretty well known as an excellent director, having movies such as Patriot Games and Clear and Present Danger and some others, I met with him, and he told me he was really interested in making this movie as authentic as he could, and wondered if I would be willing to come down in the mountains where they're filming the movie and work with him on the set and review the script and help coach the actors, which I agreed to.
Yeah, when I first looked at the article and thought about reaching out to you, I was a little hesitant about airing dirty laundry. But then I thought about it and I thought, well, this really shows the integrity of the FBI, the fact that we try to police our own, and that once Mark became a subject, we really worked very closely with our law enforcement partners in order to gather the evidence that led to the charges and his conviction. How did you feel about the film and all the other films and books that have been written about this case?
Well, the other, I think there were a couple TV shows I saw which were not accurate at all. One of the books that came out earlier was way off base. They were trying to give the theme that this was a premeditated murder and that the FBI was trying to cover it up and protect their own agent, which is totally bogus. And I was really interested in becoming involved in this movie to make sure that with a great director like they had and the producers who were all interested in telling the true story, and they gave me complete leeway in making suggestions and changes to the script, and I think in the end that they got it exactly right. I think it's going to be an outstanding movie, although it's a very sad case for everybody concerned. It will show how it all happened and how the FBI conducted the investigation that ultimately led to Mark's confession and later conviction.
All right, so let's get started. Could you take us to the beginning? Could you tell us a little bit about Mark and also about the Pikeville, Kentucky area that he was assigned to?
Yeah, Mark was really an outstanding young agent. He graduated from the University of Tampa. A nice-looking young man, was an athlete, played college soccer at Tampa, and always had wanted to become an FBI agent. Being from Connecticut, he applied as a clerk in a New Haven office and was accepted. And later on, he applied to the Connecticut State Police and was accepted. And unfortunately, in his first or second week of training, he injured himself and had to drop out of the training. So he went back to New Haven, and from there, he later applied as an agent, was accepted, and entered on duty in the FBI in October of 1986. His first assignment after training school in February of 1987 was Pikeville, Kentucky, which is a resident agency out of the Louisville Division. It's in an extremely isolated area of Kentucky in the heart of the Appalachian region where there's a lot of crime, a lot of violence, very, very poor economy. The coal business was the major economy in that area for years, and then the coal business went completely downhill, and that caused a lot of poverty, and then they had a lot of drug problems. I mean, it was just, for an FBI agent, a young agent, what a great place to learn and a great place to work, because you got all kinds of crimes to learn with. But it was a two-man RA, and the agent that had been there a long time, agent by the name of Sam Smith, who's one of the best agents that ever worked down there, he was transferred into Lexington. And the other agent there at the time was getting ready to be transferred out, so Mark came in pretty much without anybody else to work with. He was kind of on his own, learning by himself, and he hooked up with a local deputy sheriff down there who kind of got him started and showed him around the area, but he immediately liked the area and liked his assignment, unlike his wife, Kathy, who was also from Connecticut, and she had never seen any place like this. They had their daughter was very young at the time when they transferred there, and she was just kind of lost and did not like it at all and was unhappy the entire time she was there. And her whole goal, I think, was waiting until they could get transferred somewhere else.
Normally, when you are a brand new agent, your first assignment is to a small or medium-sized office, but an office where there are lots of people around, and training agents who can show you what to do, and you can volunteer for different squads to get a taste of different investigations. It was kind of odd that somebody who had never been in law enforcement before would be placed in a two-man RA.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Jerry. Had he been assigned to Lexington or Louisville or even London, who had 6 or 7 agents, another mountain-type area, but they had 6 or 7 agents, and 3 or 4 of them are very experienced, this probably would have, unfortunately, looking back on it, probably would have never happened. But the assignment, the agent in charge at the time was under the impression that he had been a Connecticut state trooper, which turned out was not the case at all, and he really had no law enforcement experience to speak of when they sent him over there. And your point is well taken. That's exactly right. The one really experienced agent that worked down there for years and was highly respected by the local state police and everybody he worked with down there, I think he'd been there 7 or 8 years, and he was transferring into Lexington. The other agent eventually went to Owensboro, so Mark was there for a little period of time. And he was joined by another agent who transferred in from Chicago, who'd worked his whole career as an undercover agent, had no idea of what it was like down there either. And so you had basically 2 people with no experience or knowledge of the area. And it was not a good situation from the beginning. But despite all that, Mark, he hit the ground running down there. He came in with a good attitude. He worked hard. Like I said, he teamed up with this one deputy sheriff, and he was showing him around the area, and there's a lot of bank robberies in that area at that time. So he made the introduction of Mark to this girl, Susan Smith, who became his informant. And she was the same way. She was excellent. And she was involved in drugs, and she knew a lot of the thugs and the criminals that were in that area, and she particularly knew this one bank robber by the name of Carl Lockhart, who was known as Cat Eyes Lockhart, and he had committed several bank robberies, and he was active in that area, and she knew him well. And Mark, after talking to her several times and assessing her worth as an informant, thought she would be the perfect person to maybe put him on some of these bank robberies, which she in fact did. But at this point, looking back on it, it brought together 2 people. One, Mark, who was very ambitious, aggressive, wanted to do a good job, wanted to go up in the bureau, and he wanted to make all the cases he could to impress someone, hopefully to get transferred out sometime. And Susan Smith, who had a terrible life up to that point. Her husband was abusive. she'd been in drugs, she had no money, and she was just really desperate. And I think she saw in Mark, maybe this is my opportunity to get out of here. So you had two ambitions coming together there, and in the end, it ended up as a disaster. She also gave information on a lot of drug activity, which he was able to pass on to the local state police, and they were able to make several local cases. She also hooked him up with a big automobile theft ring chop shop operation, which involved about 3 states, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Ohio. And it was a major case, and she was able to introduce him to a key guy in the middle of that organization, and he ended up being very successful on that one as well. But one of her major problems was she talked to everybody, and everybody liked her, that she knew everybody in the county almost, and she would exaggerate a lot of the cases they were working. She'd tell a lot of things she shouldn't be talking about out in the community. And as a result, on one occasion, she got beat up pretty bad in a bar one night by one of the girlfriends of the subject she had informed on. So she was kind of a difficult person to deal with, and Mark, up until a point, did a good job of keeping her under control, because he was paying her some money along for the information, and the relationship was going as it should be, professional, and everything was going good until she was always trying to get him to get involved with her sexually, and he kept resisting that up for as long as he finally could. And then he stepped over the line on that one occasion, and that ended up being the downfall for everybody.
Now, I read in one of the articles, on this case, that Susan and Mark's wife, Kathy, had a friendship?
That's right. Another very unusual part of the case. Kathy, of course, she was kind of a very strong-willed person. She controlled all the finances in the family, and pretty much was, the main person on the home front, and kept pretty tight reins on Mark. But she also she would take phone calls at their home from some of the subjects he's dealing with, and she would be talking with them. She's almost acting like a secretary, an FBI secretary at home for him. And in that capacity, she ended up talking to Susan on the phone quite often, and developed a friendship with her, which was not good. But she felt sorry for Susan and was trying to help her, and really doing a lot of things that family members in the Bureau shouldn't be involved with. And that was not a positive thing either.
You were saying that Susan talked a lot. Did people in the community know that she was attracted to Mark? And once they started the relationship, did she tell people about it?
Oh, yeah. Her sister knew. She would tell her sister, a lady named Shelby Ward, she would tell her everything that was going on, and exaggerate a lot of it also. So, in fact, her sister would even say that Susan could not be believed, that she lied a lot and exaggerated and embellished stories and trying to make herself look good. So, yeah, she would talk, and people in the community pretty much knew her. She was like that.
So how long was Mark actually assigned to the Pikeville RA?
He was there and started February of 1987. He reported into Pikeville, and he transferred to Miami in May of 1989. So he was there just about 2 years, and first started operating Susan as an informant in June of 1987, when he was working with her on those bank robberies that I mentioned earlier. So
they had a 2-year relationship, first a professional one, and then it switched over to much, much more.
Yeah, I'd say the first year, maybe a year and 3 months was a pretty professional type relationship, and then they crossed that line, and that for the next 7 or 8 months, they engaged in that relationship. And did anybody with the FBI, were they aware of this relationship? No, not really. Well, I take that back. His supervisor at the time was in Covington, Kentucky. The SSRA, the supervisory special agent, was in Covington, which is about 150 miles from Pikeville. So he was rarely down there, and he had no clue that this was going on. Although there were a couple times Mark would call and ask him for advice, and he would... there was a few signals that might have been picked up on then, but looking back on it, it's easy to second guess that, but he apparently didn't pick up on it. And Mark called up one time and said that Susan showed up at Christmas with a gift for him, and he called the supervisor and told him, and the supervisor told him, said, "Hey, you can't accept that. Give it back to her." And Mark said, "Well, she won't take it back." He said, "Well, put it there in the safe in the RA and don't take it, just, document it," which he did. But there's a few signals that when you look back on it, or somebody there had been there on the scene with him, a senior guy would have seen those signals and probably could have. Because Mark, I don't think he went out there with that kind of idea that he was going to get himself in a situation like that.
Right. And I think for everyone listening, it's important for them to understand that any type of relationship with an informant is is prohibited in the FBI.
Absolutely. And again, not having any close supervision or not having an agent to work with that could help him along, it resulted in the end result that it all went bad.
All right, so he gets transferred to Miami, and my understanding is that he did leave. His wife and his child are transferred, and they go to Miami, and, as far as he's concerned, he's away from Susan, the relationship is over, everything's good.
That's right.
So what happens?
Okay, he goes to Miami in May of 1989, and just about as soon as he got down there, he got subpoenaed back up to Pikeville for a couple of days. He had this chop shop operation I mentioned earlier, was getting ready for trial, so he came back to do some pretrial work, was there for a couple of days, and went back to Miami. When he came back, his partner at the time told him that a guy by the name of Ron Poole, who is now deceased, but Ron told him that, hey, there's rumors going around here that Susan Smith is pregnant, and it's your child. And of course, Mark denied it, said, "Oh, it's crazy. It's not true at all." So he said, "Well, you need to get together because she's been complaining to me, and she's been threatening to go to the newspapers and your boss and everybody else. So if there's anything going on there, you better get it straight." And Mark said, "Well, that's ridiculous. It didn't happen." So he went back to Miami, and she would call him down there occasionally and threaten him with, saying, "I'm pregnant, and it's your baby, and if you don't do something about it, I'm going to cost you your job and everything else," and those type conversations. And Mark would just keep telling her, "Hey, Susan, settle down, and if I can help you out in some way with it, I will, financially or whatever I can do, but just don't do anything crazy." He would calm her down. So at that point, he was hoping that he probably wouldn't see her again. He was going to be safely down in Miami there, and everything's going to be fine. So it turns out that didn't happen.
Well, Susan was right about one thing, and that is if she had contacted the FBI, most likely it would have resulted in him being fired.
Oh, absolutely. No doubt about it. But, when that was going on, I don't know of anybody in the division, even other than his supervisor up in Covington and maybe a couple of the agents there that supervised Pikeville. I know in Lexington, we hadn't heard any of these rumors or had any idea that anything like that was going on. And even though it's a small division and, in the Bureau, rumors fly around, but nobody had any idea that this was happening. And he was, as far as we knew, he was a really good agent, doing a good job down there, had those bank robberies and a chop shop operation, and nobody had anything but good things to say about him, and had no idea that anything of this serious was happening. And then, June the 8th, 1989, when he was in Miami and was doing a great job in Miami, according to his supervisor in the SAC there, he got a subpoena to return to Pikeville for some pretrial work with the assistant U.S. attorney in Lexington. So he flew into Huntington, West Virginia, which is the nearest airport to Pikeville, and rented a car in Huntington, and probably was going to be there, estimated 2 weeks, to do this pretrial work. Well, I think the last person he wanted to see was Susan Smith. Unbeknownst to him, Ron Poole, his partner, knew that he was coming back, and she'd been harassing him about this pregnancy report and getting something done, that Poole picked her up, brought her into Pikeville, and put her up in the same motel that Mark was staying in. So when Mark arrives there on that evening, well, who does he see? But there's Susan waiting for him, and they get in a really loud argument in the room over this pregnancy issue. So Mark says, Susan, keep your voice down. You're going to, draw attention from all the other people in the motel. And she keeps going, so he convinces her, let's go for a ride. We'll talk about this. So they go out and they drive around Pike County and go out in a real remote area called Peter Creek Mountain on the highway out of Pikeville. And they parked on the side of a road and continuing this argument. And he made some comment like, well, go ahead and have the baby, and Kathy and I can adopt it because we can give it a much better home than you can. Well, that didn't go over very well with Susan, so she absolutely loses it and comes across the car and starts slapping Mark in the face, scratching him and poking him in the eyes, and he's trying to defend himself, and he just loses it. And
this is what Mark confessed later on.
Yeah, that's what he confessed to. And says he grabbed her by the neck, tried to get him off of her, and ended up putting too much pressure, and he saw she lost consciousness. So he stops and he tries to revive her with no luck. So he gets her out of the car and takes her around to the back, sets her down by the back of the car. She just falls over, and he realizes that she's dead. So he then picks her up, puts her in the trunk of the car, and drives back into Pikeville to the motel. This is probably 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, according to Mark. And he's of course panic-stricken, realized now what he's done and what am I going to do? So he had to be in Lexington, which is 130 miles away, the next morning at 8 o'clock for a meeting with the U.S. attorney. So he gets himself cleaned up, showers, puts a suit, his bureau uniform on, and heads to Lexington to meet with the U.S. attorney with the body still in the trunk. He gets into Lexington, he parks the rental car, on a meter right in front of the federal courthouse and puts his blue light on the dash to indicate it's a law enforcement vehicle so he won't get a ticket. Goes in, meets with the U.S. attorney most of the day. They come out, have lunch, go back in. End of the day, about 5 o'clock, he returns to Pikeville. Body still in the trunk. Goes to the motel, changes clothes, goes out, gets him a bite to eat, waits till just about dusk, and then he starts driving around looking for a place to dispose of her body. And he finds a place about 9 miles out of Pikeville, a place called Harmon's Branch Road, which is an old coal mining road, kind of in a desolate area. He drives up a couple miles up that road, finds a location, a ravine, and he claims that he carries her body down to the bottom of the ravine and lays her down there in the weeds and the brush, and then drives back into Pikeville, the motel. In the next 2 weeks, he goes about his business as usual, serving subpoenas and doing, pre-trial type work with the U.S. attorney. And then after the 2 weeks is up, he returns to Miami.
I've got to stop you there for a minute because, I'd like to believe that this was, and I'm sure it was, a crime of passion, but it does say about a lack of something.
Well, I know exactly.
That he could live with this for 2 weeks.
Yeah, how about a year? And then a year later, when I first interviewed him down there, he still had this story all made up that he was going to try his best shot to talk his way out of it. But he also told me later that he was absolutely tormented for a year. He couldn't sleep. He was vomiting, and he'd wake up. He couldn't function. He just kept the guilt, and I really do believe that at that point. But I can't explain that either, Jerry. I mean, how he could step there 2 weeks knowing that he's got a body laying out there in a ditch somewhere nearby. I don't know how he did it. So.
And during that 2 weeks, is his partner who had brought Susan to the motel, is he asking him where Susan is?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. He's saying, hey, and her sister, she calls into the data. She called the state police and said, my sister is, I think that was June the 16th. And, June the 8th is when the murder occurred. Well, 8 days later, her sister calls the state police and files a missing person report. Says, my sister's missing, and she was she's working with the FBI, and nobody's seen her. So they knew her reputation as a runaway, and that she ran with all these other criminal element around there. So they thought, well, it's Susan. She just ran off. No one really suspected Mark initially. But then after they interviewed Shelby, the sister, she kept insisting that I think Mark Putnam had something to do with this. Well, they didn't really believe it initially. And then little signals, they were starting doing some interviews, and other people were saying, Mark seemed to have a funny relationship with her. So the rumors were flying around there.
But all of this is occurring, I take it. He's back in Miami at this time.
Oh, yeah. He's back in Miami, and Ron Poole is calling him, telling him, hey, they're asking questions about you up here, Mark, with your relationship with Susan. She's missing, and you got any ideas what could have happened to her or whatever? And he kept saying, no, that's a bunch of crap. That didn't happen. I've heard, I know the rumors are going around, but there's nothing to it. Don't believe it and all this stuff. Well, when we got involved, it was, thinking prior to May 7th of 1990, probably 5 or 6 months later, Sam Smith, the agent who'd been down there for years, was back over in Pikeville one day for serving a subpoena or doing some kind of official work, and he met up with one of his former good friends, a detective with the Kentucky State Police, and this detective said, Sam, I want to tell you something just between us. We've got a missing person down here. He was a bureau informant, and the word is that Mark Putnam might have had something to do with it. And Sam said, what? You got to be kidding. He said, no, he said, I know it sounds ridiculous, but that's what the rumor is. So Sam came back to Lexington, and he came into my office and said, hey, Jim, I need to talk to you about something here. It's pretty serious. I said, yeah, what is it? So he tells me what the detective told him. I said, holy cow, are they serious? He said, yep, they're serious. And he said, the guy told me, I have complete faith in him. He wouldn't just make something like this up. So we called the assistant agent in charge in Louisville, Tom Miller, and relayed the information to Tom. And he said, oh, gosh, we can't have rumors like that floating around about an FBI agent and informant down there. Go back down there and get with the post commander and see what he says. So I went down next day to Pikeville and met with the Kentucky State Police post commander, Captain Gary Rose, who is an outstanding individual who had worked down there most of his career and was very familiar with the mountains and the people and the crime problems. I mean, the guy's just a tremendous individual and who I have nothing but the highest respect for.
Before you continue, can we do a little sidebar, and could you give me a little information about you? I mean, because now you're involved in the case. So why don't you just take a brief moment to tell us a little bit about when you joined the FBI and why you joined the FBI before we continue with your part in this case.
Okay. Yeah, I entered on duty with the FBI in February 13th, 1967. Prior to that, I was in the United States Marine Corps as an officer where I served for 5 years as a captain. And when my time was up in the Marines, I was looking around on what I'm going to do, and just happened to run into a former Marine officer that I'd served with in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, who was an FBI agent in Norfolk at the time. And he came out to the base and was looking for doing a background investigation or something of that nature. And he asked me when I got out, and I told him. He said, what do you got in mind doing? I said, I have no idea. I'm going to start looking around. He said, how about the FBI? Would you be interested in being an agent? I said, yeah, absolutely. But I'm not an accountant or a lawyer. He said, you don't have to be. If you get a diversified 3 years experience in the Marine Corps would qualify you with your degree. He said, I'll set you up an interview with our SAC. So next week I went down and interviewed with the SAC and took the test and went through all the hoops and got my appointment letter just before I was released. So I was just a stroke of luck. And from that point on, after training school, I was assigned my first office to Minneapolis, the St. Paul RA. From there I was assigned to Denver and was up in the Casper, Wyoming RA for 3 or 4 years. And then I worked on special assignments over on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation during Wounded Knee and the RESMURS case. In fact, in the RESMURS case, my best friend was one of the victims of that, Jack Kohler, who worked with me in Denver. So after that, I was transferred back into Denver headquarters, where I worked on the bank robbery squad for the next 3 or 4 years, and then I got my office of preference transfer to the Frankfort, Kentucky RA in 1977, and then I was promoted to supervisor of a public corruption task force. Then I was the SSRA in Covington, and a supervisor of the organized crime squad in Louisville, and then I ended up my last 9 years, I was supervisor of the Lexington office.
And that's where all of this happened?
Yeah, that's when this happened, when I was in Lexington.
So you're originally from Kentucky?
Yes.
So you knew the people, you knew how to operate with the different crimes and, events that occurred there? Yeah,
I knew the area very well.
Unlike Mark?
Right, exactly.
All right, so you're meeting with this person from the state police.
Yeah, Captain Rose. So he tells me that, I said, hey, Gary, we've got rumors going around here that Mark Putnam might be involved in a missing informant down here. So he says, Jim, I would never accuse an FBI agent of anything this serious unless I had evidence, which I don't. He said, but my experience tells me, and from what I've heard and just what I know about this girl's past, he might very well could have been involved in that. I went, holy cow, Gary, we've got to get to the bottom of it. We can't let this just hang. I said, how about I'll try to get permission from the Bureau through my SAC, see if we can't do a joint kidnapping investigation. Although we have no evidence of a kidnapping, there's a presumptive clause that if someone is missing and you suspect foul play, then after 24 hours you can presume she's been taken across the state line. Maybe we can sell that to the Bureau and then give us an entree into the case. So he agreed, and I contacted Tom Miller again at the ASAC, and he contacted FBI headquarters, and they approved opening a case under the kidnapping statute. So we agreed to have an agent and team up with a detective in 4 teams, and we'd go down there and redo the entire missing person investigation, not second-guessing the state police, because they did a credible job up to that point, but they had nowhere to go from there without access to Mark, which they didn't have at that point. So he told me, go down, pick out 4 of your more senior and experienced agents of that area and go down to Pikeville and get this thing resolved. So I selected 4 guys in Lexington that had worked, all of them had worked down in the mountains, and a couple of them had even been assigned to Pikeville years ago. So they were 4 really experienced, outstanding, hard-working agents, and we formed a little team there, went down to Pikeville, hooked up with 4 detectives, and the first thing we did was review the missing person case. After we went through the case, we went back to the conference room that night, and I said, okay, guys, let's go around the room, just the agents that were in the room, not the detectives, just the agents. So let's go around after you've read this report, and let's come up with the logical suspect. Say she was murdered or abducted or whatever. Let's just say she was, the worst scenario. And tell me who you think the most likely suspect would be. So the first agent comes back. He said, I think it's probably Lockhart, the bank robber. She testified against him. He has a reputation for violence. And, it'd be just like a revenge type motive, which sounded logical to me. The next agent agreed with him. Said, yeah, I think it's probably somehow connected to that bank robbery. The third agent said, well, I believe it could be those drug dealers out of Milwaukee that she's supposed to meet up with over in West Virginia, which she was. And then the fourth agent said, I think it was Mark Putnam. We said, wow. What? Are you crazy? He said, no, look at this. Suppose this is all true, what we're hearing. Suppose he was having an affair. Suppose she was pregnant. He had everything to lose. I said, yeah, you're right about that. So I made the decision then. I said, well, let's do this. Let's just zero in on Mark. Let's start on him as the prime suspect, and we'll eliminate him or get the evidence to show that he was involved. One way or the other, we need to get him resolved first of all, and then if we wash him out, then we'll go to Cat Eyes, Lockhart, and the others. So that was our plan. So off we went, and then everything came together, and we ended up just about where the state police had ended up, the missing person. We were down to zero leads, and we didn't have anything else to substantiate what we thought. So I thought, well, at that time, it's time to interview Mark. So let's go to Miami and conduct an interview with him and see what he has to say.
So now, would this be a criminal interview or an administrative interview?
No, it was a criminal interview. In fact, it was really a Kentucky State Police case. It was a murder case, is what it turned out to be. Although at that point, we were still doing it as a kidnapping, but it was criminal all the way.
And in this initial interview, was it just FBI, or did somebody
No, we had two state police detectives went with me. And one of the good things that happened, just a lucky thing, the SAC Miami's Bill Gavin. I don't know if, Jerry, if you ever knew Bill or had occasion to work with him, but he was an outstanding agent and a really, really good SAC. And I was lucky enough in my first office, he and I were partners in the St. Paul RA. And we remained friends ever since then. So he was SAC because, coming into a big office like Miami from a place like Louisville and accusing one of your agents of murder, that's a pretty sensitive position to be in. So I was lucky to have Bill there, who kind of, made me feel welcome, and also made all the resources of Miami available to me, and had a supervisors meeting the first day and told them exactly what was going on. Of course, they all were like me initially. They didn't believe it, but said, let's just everybody stay out of the way and don't be talking about this case, and tell your troops not to talk about it until it's resolved. And Bill was really helpful, and it's turned out in the end he was extremely helpful in getting this thing brought to its logical conclusion. So we go down to Miami, and in fact, unlike a lot of places you go into a big office, Bill Gavin was there at the airport to meet us and took us out to dinner the first night. And we kind of briefed him over dinner as to what the deal was, and he kind of saw then, we got a problem. So Mark's supervisor, who was another really good guy, he was, of course, he didn't believe it at all. He thought Mark was, and rightfully so, he thought Mark was really one of his best agents on his squad, and said, this can't be right. There's no way this could happen. So, well, I hope not, but we've got to find out. So the next day, we met Mark about 10 o'clock in the morning in the Miami office. Came in, very friendly, came over, shook my hand, asked about everybody in Louisville, how's everything going. He appeared to be relaxed at that point. And said, hey, I want to, I know why you're here, and I understand you got a job to do, and I'll cooperate, whatever you need. No problem. So I advised him of his rights, and we went into the interview, which lasted about 7 hours. He completely, he had a story already made up, trying to explain everything. And he went on and on and on, and it was apparent that he was not going to admit to it. And
did you believe him?
No, I didn't. About halfway through the interview, at first I kept thinking all along, there's no way an FBI agent is going to commit a murder, or particularly a good guy like Mark. That just doesn't seem, there's got to be an explanation for it. But the more I went into listening to his explanation, it wasn't making sense. And I'm thinking, oh gosh, I think he might have done this. So, in fact, the very first question I asked when I started the interview, I said, Mark, how old is Susan? And he said, Jim, she was 28. And when he said was, it kind of hit me like, wait a minute, he's talking in the past tense here. So that kind of rang a bell with me. And then as we went along, he had the interview, the car that he used while he was at Pikeville was turned in after a week, which is unusual because he'd rented it for 2 weeks. So one of our agents went over to Huntington at the car rental place and found out that it had a cracked windshield. So that raised another red flag. And his explanation in his interview was, well, I was following a coal truck, a piece of coal flew off and hit the windshield and cracked it. Well, that didn't really ring true because the way the crack was on the right-hand side of the mirror, and it was actually caused by the struggle in the car, as we found out later. But that raised another red flag. Cracked windshield. Some of the things he said just didn't ring true. So we got about 7 hours into the interview. It was apparent that he wasn't going to. He denied that flat out. I asked him, "Did you kill Susan?" "No, Jim, I would never do that. I couldn't do that." So I decided, well, there's no need continuing. We were running out of steam, as he was too. So I said, well, we'll continue this in the morning. So we left, and I went into Bill, and I said, by the way, Mark, I said, when we left, I said, would you consider having a polygraph given to you? He said, oh, yeah, no problem, be glad to. I said, well, we'll see if we can set one up. So I went in and talked to Bill Gavin, and Gavin called the FBI headquarters polygraph unit. And they said, yeah, no problem, come on up, we'll do it Saturday morning. I remember this was Friday. So next morning, Mark came in again, and this time Kathy was with him, his wife, and she was adamant that she wanted to talk to me. The supervisor said, well, I can talk to you, whatever you want. She said, no, I want to talk to Jim Huggins. So he brought her in, and I interviewed her, and her main complaint was Ron Poole was, she did, of course, she knew nothing about this at all at that point, that he had actually killed Susan. Mm-hmm. So she was, of course, defending him and blaming Ron Poole for all the things he'd done wrong down there, which she was about 90% correct on a lot of it. And it was more like an OPR type matter. So I kept saying, well, I'll take all the information, and the FBI will definitely check into it, and we'll resolve it. That kind of calmed her down. And then got back with Mark and said, Mark, you're the only one that knows what happened here. So we need to go to D.C. and take a polygraph, and it's all arranged if you agree. He said, oh, yeah, no problem. So
why, can I stop and just ask why you're going to D.C.? Because I'm sure the Miami office has polygraphers on staff.
No, I think he realized that the seriousness of it, they wanted it done at headquarters, and Bill Gavin had arranged it, so he didn't really question it at all. So we flew up. I flew with him. We went out to the airport that night at Miami and flew to Washington. I sat with him on the plane, and we talked not about the case, because I'd advised him and all this. So I said, I'm not going to ask any questions, Mark, until we get there, but I'm just tell the truth. That's all the advice I can give you. Just tell the truth. And he kept nodding, yeah, okay. And then he talked casually all the way up to D.C. And we got there. He went to wherever he spent the night. I went to a separate hotel and met him in the headquarters polygraph unit the next morning about 9:30, 10 o'clock. Then I went in earlier, and I briefed the polygrapher, Bill Tigan, who was a bureau polygrapher at the time, and a good one. And I gave him the 302s I had and the first statement that he gave. He reviewed everything and brought Mark in. Long story short, he failed the polygraph on the 4 key questions. Did you cause the disappearance of Susan Smith? Did the car play a role in her disappearance? Did you have a sexual relationship with her? And one other, did you kill her? And he failed on all of them. So Hagen told him at that point, said, Mark, you got some problems here. You're showing deception on these. You need to, tell the truth. And he kind of dropped his head and said, well, you're right. I know I have a problem with the polygraph, but I want to tell you all about this. I want to get it over with. But before I do, can I call my wife and tell her? Of course, we said, yeah, sure. So there's a adjoining room there. He went in the room, called Kathy in Miami, and he said, hey, I've got some problems up here with this polygraph. And before we could say what, she said, don't say another word, Mark. You come on home and we'll work this out. Don't say anything. So he came back very apologetic. He said, hey, guys, I'm sorry, but Kathy wants me to come home and wants to get an attorney and before I go any further. Said, I want to get it over with. I want to cooperate, but I've got to listen to her too. So at that point, we thought, oh, shoot, we've lost our opportunity probably. He'll get back, get a lawyer, and then we're going to be stuck. So I rode out to the airport with him. He got a flight back to Miami that night, and I got a flight back to Louisville. So I rode out on the metro with him, and sitting there together, I said, Mark, I'm going to say something, and I don't want you to reply to it at all. Don't say a word. You just listen to me. I said, what I think happened is, I don't know, I'm just guessing, but I said, I think you and Susan went for a ride in that car, and you got into some kind of altercation, and something happened. I think probably a terrible accident, and you panicked, and that's what happened. And he didn't say, no, that's crazy. He didn't show any emotion. He just dropped his head and kind of nodded. And I said, listen, when you get back to Miami tonight, first thing in the morning, you be in the Miami office, you report to Bill Gavin, and he'll help you through this. As soon as he got on the plane, I called Bill Gavin in Miami and told him what had happened, and said, be expecting a call from Mark first thing in the morning. So probably around 10 o'clock, I'm at home in Kentucky, and Bill Gavin called me and said, hey, Mark's in here and with his wife, and he came in and said he was prepared to talk and get this all resolved, but before he did, he thought he should probably talk to an attorney. So he asked me for a recommendation, and I told him, Mark, I can't recommend anyone, but I do know the name of some that you might want to call. So he gave me the name of a guy that had been a former AUSA down there, named Bruce Emmett, who Mark called up and set up an appointment. So I said, well, what do we do now, Bill? He said, can you get back down here? Because Emmett says he'll talk to him, and then he'll get back with us. I said, sure, I'll be down there first thing Monday. So I flew back down to Miami on Sunday night and was in the office Monday, and we waited for about 3 days. Nothing happened. Then I think like the fourth day I'm down there, the attorney calls back and says, I've talked to Mark, and, you guys can't do anything. You can't charge him with a crime without a body. You don't have a body, and there's no but just rumor and speculation, which he was correct. And he said, however, and I told Mark this, and he said, but Mark insists he wants to get this over with. He wants to tell the truth and get it all finished. He can't go on with it. So he said, I want to come in with a proffer. Okay, so that afternoon he comes to the Miami office and meets with myself and Bill Gavin, and he says, here's what Mark wants. He'll confess to murder. He'll confess to killing Susan and putting her body in a location near Pikeville, and if you agree to it, he wants 10 years for manslaughter. He wants to serve his time in a federal prison, and one other caveat I don't recall exactly. Those are the two main things. And we said, well, first of all, we can't make any deals with you because this is a state of Kentucky case. So you'll have to deal with the Commonwealth attorney up in Pike County, who was a friend of ours, a guy named John Paul Runyon, who's an old-time prosecutor over there. So we put Mark's attorney in touch with Mr. Runyon, and also we talked to the U.S. attorney in Lexington, who said he could agree that he could get the Bureau of Prisons to take him, and it'd be all up to Runyon to agree to the sentence. So Runyon said, look, I can't go for 10 years. That's ridiculous for what he did. I said, there's no way. He said, I'd have to have at least 16 years for manslaughter. So we were stuck. We either had to take it or we're going to have an agent and probably be fired from the Bureau, but if committed a murder, we'll never be able to prove it. So we really didn't have a choice, and we all agreed, state police and the FBI all agreed that, we'll go with that. So he comes back in. This goes on for about 2 weeks of negotiations back and forth between Miami and Pike County and the attorneys. So at the very end, he agrees to it. I go back down to Miami again, and June the 4th is when I went back down there. The polygraph at headquarters was on May the 19th. So I ended up going back to Miami on June the 4th, meet with Mark and his attorney in the attorney's office up in Fort Lauderdale, and he gave us a complete confession to the whole situation. And right at the beginning, here's a real unusual twist in the case, a miracle, I should say. Just before I start taking the confession, it's like 6 o'clock in the evening, I said, Mark, before we start, there's agents standing by up in Pikeville ready to go out to the location where you put Susan's body, see if they can recover her. You need to tell us where you put her body because it's getting dark up there, and we need to get those agents out there before dark so we can see if we can find her. He said, do you have a map or anything? I said, well, tell me the area. I'm familiar with that area up there. He said, well, you know where Marlowe's Bar is on Highway 23? I said, yeah, sure do. He said, then there's a road right across there called Harmon's Branch. I said, I know exactly where it is. He said, well, go up that road about 2 miles, and on the left you'll see a pullout where the people have ridden these trail bikes, and they've worn off the grass in that area. And that's where I parked, in that little hill right off to the left there. There's a little steep hill goes down the ravine, so I took her body and put it right down at the bottom of that ravine. I said, okay, so I go in and call up to the state police post in Pikeville and tell them, hey, here's where he said she is. They said, okay. About 30 minutes later, I get a call back from one of the agents. They said, hey, we found her remains exactly where he said. He said, you're not going to believe this. He said, while we were looking and we were out there on the scene, this coal truck comes by, and the guy stopped and wanted to know what we were doing. And I said, we're with the FBI. We're doing a crime scene investigation, recovering remains of a body. He said, well, it's a good thing you're doing it tonight, because first thing in the morning we were coming down here with a bulldozer to fill in that ravine.
Wow.
So if we'd been, a day late or whatever, we never would have found her. Probably still could have gone ahead with what he told us and maybe gotten a prosecution, but it would have been touch and go. But it's just luck. Mm. So he confessed, and then he wasn't arrested at that point.
Oh, he was allowed to go home?
Yeah, after that, he went home, and because he hadn't been charged with anything at that point. We talked to the U.S. attorney, and his attorney got together, and they agreed to let him remain at home during that time. And then on June the 11th, the Pike County Grand Jury indicted him for first-degree manslaughter. And he returned the next day with his attorney, June the 12th, to Pike County Circuit Court, and he pleaded guilty to that charge and was sentenced to 16 years. And then immediately after that, state police took him on their aircraft directly to the federal prison in Otisville, New York, where he was incarcerated.
Wow. Such a sad story.
Oh, it's
such
terrible.
a sad story.
That's exactly what the movie shows, and it's what the director in the movie said. He said, this is nothing, and Joe Sharkey, who wrote the book, everybody agreed it's just a sad story for everybody concerned, for the victim and her family and her kids and Mark's family and his kids, and even sadder, his wife died on February 1998. She was 38 years old from an apparent heart attack.
Wow. You would have had to think that, if she had heart problems, that all of this, had a lot to do with, her health.
Absolutely. And she was drinking very heavily there at the end, too. And after his initial incarceration, he was transferred to the FCI in Rochester, Minnesota. She stuck with him, Kathy and the kids. He had another little boy at that time. They moved up there to Rochester so they could visit him while he was there. Then she eventually went back to Connecticut. And then that's when she really started drinking heavily, I guess, and she passed away 38 years old. Then Mark was released from prison. He did 10 years and was released in 2000 for good behavior. And he's remarried now, I understand, living somewhere down south.
Wow. And what about Susan's family? How did they react to finding out that an FBI agent was responsible for her death?
They filed a major lawsuit against the Bureau, obviously, and because of the timing and everything, it was dismissed, so they didn't get anywhere with that. But they were, Shelby, the sister, believed it all along. Turns out she was right all along. And
what do you mean by the timing? Because you would think they do have a good lawsuit. She was an informant.
They had like a statute of limitations, and I think when they filed it, they were too late to get in under the statute. She had a local attorney there in Pikeville, and he waited around, and when they finally filed the lawsuit, it was too late, and they dismissed it. Susan had 2 kids. One of them died from an overdose of methamphetamine here just a few years ago, and I think her daughter is still over in that area somewhere. She'd be up, 30, 40 years old now, I guess.
Well, I would imagine that investigating this case and the results of this case had to have a big effect on your career, and I guess in a good way and a bad way, because when you talk about Bureau integrity, to look at this case and realize how strongly and how diligently the FBI went after Mark.
Yeah, we all decided, we went down and said, hey guys, look, regardless of who it is, we're going to follow the facts wherever they lead, and if he's involved, then so be it. I mean, it's not the FBI, it's an individual. We look at him just like everybody else. Forget he's an FBI agent. And that's the way all the guys that work with me on this deserve a lot of credit, because they all approached it just like that. I mean, they'd see something, they wouldn't try to explain it away in Mark's favor or anything like that. It was straight down the line. They all approached it the same way I did. That hey, this is what we're supposed to do.
Well, developing informants, as you know and I know, is a very, very crucial part of the FBI, especially now that we're, instead of just being a law enforcement agency, we're also an intelligence gathering agency. And so could you talk about, some of the things in place as far as informants and human intelligence and cooperating witnesses that hopefully will stop things like this from happening?
It was like you said, in your experience, I'm sure you would agree that having good informants and sources is the backbone of any success you have in these investigations. However, there's got to be good rules in place, because they're all potentially problems, and you better be aware of all the problems in the past and learn from them. But after the Putnam case, the Bureau did tighten up some of the rules, particularly having supervisors actually go out and meet informants themselves and observe them, at least in the area. A lot more closer supervision as far as that goes, particularly dealing with male-female type situations. If it's a female informant, then you want to probably at all costs have two agents present on any of the meetings. And if you had even with female agents meeting with a male informant, probably good to have a female agent or two female agents, or at least two agents. Forget the male-female, but just two agents on any informant contact, if at all possible. Now, as you know, there are certain situations that come up where you just can't do that. But if you do, you better document it as to why and try to go with that rule, because Mark was, every meeting he had, all his payments, everything was just one guy, one person. It was him. And then, things get said, and she's making her move on Mark and trying to think Kathy will divorce him, he'll marry me, and we'll be happily ever after out of here. That was her goal. And Mark's thinking, now she's going to give me 2 more bank robbers or whatever, and I'm going to be transferred out and get a good incentive award. So it was two, like I said earlier, example of two ambitions that collided for the wrong reasons, and it ended up in a disaster and a real tragedy for everybody.
Wow. So how much time after the end of that investigation did you remain with the FBI? When did you retire?
I retired in November of '95, so this was probably 5 years later. When Mark, another thing, when he went to prison, I got 2 or 3 letters from him when he got there, and I mean, just reading the letters is just very, very depressing. I mean, he was at that point, he knew what he'd done. He'd confessed, and it was all over with. And then he's telling me, "I'm sorry, I embarrassed the FBI." And in fact, when I finished the confession in Miami, he came over and shook my hand. He said, "Jim, when you get back to Louisville, do me a favor and please apologize to all the employees in the Louisville Division. Tell them I'm sorry, I embarrassed them, and just no way I can ever say I'm sorry, but please tell them that I didn't do it to hurt the Bureau or hurt them in any way. I just made a terrible mistake, and I've got to live with it."
Yeah, I've discussed that with listeners many times about each FBI agent knows, one thing you don't do is embarrass the FBI.
Right. And he was very, very, he was very proud to be an FBI agent. That's what he always wanted to do, and he was just really proud to be an agent. And then it all collapsed on him like that, and it was just devastating for him. And I really believe now that it's all over, I can't explain how he could live with himself for that year and for that 2 weeks in Pikeville after what he'd done. I don't think anyone knows the answer to that one.
Especially as an agent, as a law enforcement, official.
Yeah.
I mean, at the end, especially with all the clues pointing at him, he had to know that at some point it was all going to come together, and he was going to be charged with it.
Yeah, he said that later, that he knew it was just a matter of time, and until it all came down. But I said, well, why didn't you tell us the first interview, Mark? You wanted to get it over with. Why didn't you come out then? He said, well, I don't know. I just thought, well, I might as well give it my best shot and just see how much they have. It's kind of feeling us out. And I think Kathy was putting the pressure on him, too, at that time. Don't you tell him anything. Don't do this, don't do that. So he was caught in a trap there, and I guess he's going to give it his best shot. But then after he did, and Joe Sharkey, the guy that wrote the book, told me he spent lots of hours up at Rochester interviewing Mark and Kathy. And he said he never, at that point, he didn't find anything Mark said that he questioned. He believed he was completely truthful in the whole thing. Where a lot of people were saying, it was all premeditated. He was trying to save himself, and the Bureau was protecting him and all that, which is all bogus. Joe, he saw the truth, and he and I got together down on the set for the movie and compared notes, and we agreed just about on everything.
Wow.
And I think that movie is going to... Now, they've got some dramatic scenes in there that didn't happen, but it's nothing to deviate from the facts of the case. It's just action shots where the shots fired here and there when they're chasing a bank robber, that kind of stuff. But
right. They always throw that.
In fact, I told Philip Noyes, the director, I said, Philip, you can't shoot a guy running like that in the back. He said, well, how would you do it? So I got him to change it around a little bit so it would make half sense. But I said, no one ever fired a shot. He said, but you got to have some action, mate. He's an Australian guy. He said, you got to have some action, mate, or people won't sit in the movie for 2 hours. But there's just little things like that. Did nothing that detracted from the facts, and he really should. The movie comes out as just two people and how they came together with their own ambitions and how that it all just fell apart.
So when is that movie coming out?
It should be in the next month or two. I thought it was going to be in May, but I haven't heard anything. I'm going to be talking to the producer here in the next week.
Well, let me know so I can make sure to.
I sure will.
Announce it on the podcast.
Good, and you might too if you get a chance. This book he's got out now, Jerry, Above Suspicion. It's the first one came out about 20-some years ago. This one it's a paperback, and it's outstanding. He clears up a lot of the misinformation in the first book, and he has an epilogue to the book that's really interesting.
All right, I'll put a link to the book in the this episode's show notes. Okay, so you retired in 1995. What have you been doing since then?
Well, see, after 95, I went to work for the Kentucky Attorney General in the following spring in 96, and as the head of their public corruption unit. And then I worked there for 7 years with the Attorney General that I initially went to work for, and then he was elected to Congress, so at that point I retired for good. Then I've done 2 or 3 TV documentaries on another case I'd worked back in the 80s, 70s, and 80s. This was a drug organization that ended up, they were involved in the Judge Wood murder case down in Phoenix, and they were all corrupt police officers out of Lexington. And they were running a major cocaine distribution ring back and forth from Colombia.
And that was another FBI case?
Yes.
Sounds like I might need to contact you again later this year and talk about that case.
Yeah, that's really a good one. That was another stroke of luck in the investigation that brought that one in.
I like to give everybody that I interview an opportunity to have the last word. So if there's anything that you'd like to say about this case or just about your FBI career, this is the time to do it. What would you like to say? Well,
as far as this case goes, I think the best way to sum it up is just say it was a tragedy for everybody concerned. It was tragic for the victim, of course, and her family and her children. It was also a tragedy for Mark's family and for Mark, because he had an outstanding career ahead of him. And he made a major mistake, which he confessed to, and it ruined his whole life. And and the director of the movie even said this was nothing but a tragic situation for everybody. But as far as my career goes, had an outstanding career to almost 30 years. Thoroughly enjoyed every minute of it. Had nothing but utmost respect for the FBI, which I still do. I had to retire mandatory when I was at 57 because that was a rule. If it hadn't been, I would have stayed until they kicked me out because I enjoyed every minute of it.
And that's the end of the interview. As always, back at jerrywilliams.com, you'll find photos of Jim Huggins, links to newspaper articles about the Mark Putnam investigation and Above Suspicion by Joe Sharkey, the book and soon-to-be-released feature film about the tragic saga that occurred between Mark Putnam and Susan Smith. If you enjoyed the episode, I hope you share it with your friends, family, and associates. I make it easy for you. At the bottom of the episode show notes, you'll find all the social media share buttons. I did have a great crime fiction recommendation for you this week, but because we're running long, I'll tell you about it during next week's episode. So my crime fiction recommendation for this week will just have to be my own FBI crime thriller, Pay to Play, about a female FBI agent investigating corruption in the Philadelphia strip club industry. Available at Amazon.com. And don't forget to sign up for my newsletter about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. Sign up when you see the pop-up at jerrywilliams.com. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.